Hi everyone, this is Dan. Today we're going to be talking about a special topic, social media and politics. For the purposes of this lecture, we'll be focusing on American executive politics. The election of the president, not necessarily the election of individual congresspeople or governors. First, it's important to understand that elections are technologies. Elections can aggregate opinion, so they could say, we have different options. Will we like which of them? Generally, in American politics, we have binary options. Some cities have ranked choice voting. Some cities also have, and states have, different sorts of referenda initiatives. Almost all of these are formed as binaries, except for things that have ranked choices. Moment of selection. An election, at least in the United States, happens on a regular schedule. These schedules then organize our political and communication activity in the run-up and the time between elections. So then we have a sequence of events that leads to the time when we'll be deciding who a new president is, who a new senator is, or who a new representative is. Further, elections are a release of energy. People become very intersubjectively invested in elections. Who is going to win, who's going to lose, what the stakes are, and so forth. The system in the United States includes multiple layers of elections and caucuses that take place over a fixed period of time. Although this tends to mean our elections can't very effectively aggregate opinion, they do function as an important moment of selection. That there is a winner afterwards, and that winner will be in charge for several years. Although there are certain kinds of options available to remove a sitting president or to remove judges or someone else, these options are very rarely taken. And generally, it is considered preferable, both from a political standpoint and the perspective of the United States Supreme Court, to allow various political solutions happening through these elections to decide on future policy preferences. The key thing in all of this, since these elections have a moment of selection, that they're moving toward a particular time, it is important to have the most votes for a particular binary position then. I'll explain more. Elections. In the United States, elections are geographically bounded. That means that people in different areas elect an individual to represent that area. This is representative democracy, or liberal democracy. Liberal democracy means that you generally keep what you make, at least if you're interested in 18th century political philosophy. If you are, let's chat. They're also temporally bounded, meaning that we're moving toward an election day. So here, we try to elect one person to represent one area at a particular time. That person also tends to represent a party. Generally in the United States, there is such a thing as an election day. Oregon doesn't really have an election day. It's weird. All ballots here are submitted by mail. This is also true in Washington State, and it's also very common in Montana and Colorado. It's likely that this trend will spread across the western states. This is important because it means that elections in the western states are very different from elections in the eastern states. In the eastern states, getting people physically to the polling place is a major concern and a very clear way to win the election. In the West, encouraging people to return the ballots and what kind of communications you send to them once they have the ballot in hand constitutes an entire another vista of strategy that is being worked on as we speak. For the presidency, we have an electoral college. This comes from a time period when there was the indirect election both of the president and of senators from individual states. The direct election of senators is relatively recent in the United States. There are a total of 538 electoral votes. One electoral vote for each member of their House of Representatives, one for each senator for a total of 2 per state, and then 3 additional electoral votes representing the District of Columbia. Why representation for the District of Columbia? There are several 100,000 Americans who live there, and it seems only equitable that they would have representation just as much as people from North Dakota. Parliamentary systems are very different, so any advice you take from this lecture, you need to carefully tailor for the system you're engaging. Parliamentary systems tend not to be as geographically bounded and are not bounded to individual identities. Instead, candidates vote for a particular party. That party then has a slate of persons who will represent it. This is important because in those systems, you won't be campaigning for a particular person, but instead for an ideology. This makes those elections a lot different. They have different issues, they have different strategies, they have different ways to try to destroy your opponent. Furthermore, there are a number of parliamentary systems that have snap elections. In the United States, if the two political parties reach a loggerheads, it becomes impossible for them to cooperate. And in the current form of government, or the current political polarity of the parties, if this happens in a particular set of ways, it can actually lead to the government shutting down in such a way that it could cause the United States to default on its debt payments. The United States debt payments are a key part of many individual retirees' investment portfolios and a major aspect of the world financial system. In a parliamentary system, this would never be allowed to take place. Instead of allowing any particular party to shut down the government or to not pass a bill, a failure of basic governance would be met with something called a snap election. A snap election allows the current prime minister or the House, whatever organ they have, to say they have no confidence. After a no confidence vote, an election will happen in very short order. In these systems, then, elections will take place until a functional government is found. This is very different than the United States. Here, we would continue to have a non-functional government until at least one more round of elections had passed. These snap elections, particularly popular in Japan, constitute a very different system. The key takeaway from all this, and the variety of systems available, is that in the United States, the person with the most votes wins the election. I'll say that again. In the United States, the person with the most votes wins the election. I know it sounds surprisingly simple when you say it that way, but the person with the most votes wins the election. We're good? The person with the most votes wins the election. Most of the votes are cast on a Tuesday, early in November. Does this all make sense? Good. You have a lot of media options for coordinating your campaign. First, you could use print. You could put advertisements in newspapers. You could seek newspaper endorsements, as well as sending direct mail. You can send people cards or letters, either supporting yourself or attacking your opponent. Television. You can buy advertisements on broadcast or cable. Broadcast advertisements tend to reach a slightly wider audience and are more expensive. Cable advertisements reach a narrower audience and are cheaper. Radio. There are lots of advertisements on the radio. Internet. You could buy sponsored statuses on Facebook, trending hashtags on Twitter, that was one of Romney's favorites, or even just buy regular display advertising. There's lots of advertising available for a campaign on the internet. You could buy other media as well. You could buy billboards, regular lawn signs, t-shirts, buttons, perhaps even temporary tattoos. There are lots of kinds of display media that are available for a campaign. The key is picking the right kind of campaign for the right prices at the right time in the election. You have to select the right media. In a U.S. House campaign, buying can be very difficult. Often you'll have a small district in a very large media market. I'll use an example of Oregon geography. There are 5 congressional districts in Oregon. 4 of the congressional representatives represent the Valley. That means the city of Portland, Salem, Albany-Corvallis, and Eugene. That's a very small area. As you know, it's about 7,000 square miles. It is a narrow strip of land where most of the people in Oregon live. One representative covers the rest of the state. You could thus buy advertisements in if you were the outstate representative, you could buy advertisements in all of your media markets cheaply and efficiently. If you were trying to buy an advertisement in one of the other 4 races, you would have to buy an advertisement that would apply in all of the congressional districts. This also includes a major American media market. Thus, buying television advertising for a U.S. House-level election in Oregon, in the Valley, is very inefficient because you're unable to buy an ad that reaches just Corvallis or just Salem. Instead, you're also buying access to the Portland suburbs, somewhere where you aren't running. Senate, presidential, and gubernatorial races are different. They are more efficient. You're able to buy advertisements that cross entire swaths of the area since every area is voting for the same candidate. An important note about buying any media is that the impression and power of an advertisement drops as the race continues. Impressions are durable. What do I mean by that? Once you have a negative Q-score as a celebrity or a politician, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get back to a positive Q-score. What's a Q-score? A Q-score is a proprietary metric used by an advertising company and a number of people in the advertising industry to balance the positive impression of you versus the negative impression compared to how many people are aware of you. No, aside from Mitt Romney, no politician has won their party's nomination to be president with a negative Q-score. No one has become president with a negative Q-score. These impressions are durable. Once people know about you, they tend not to change their opinion. This means that if there's a blitz of negative advertising against you in June and it destroys your reputation, it is very unlikely that you will be able to substantially affect the other candidate as Election Day draws closer. It gets worse. The closer you get to Election Day, the less effective the advertising will be. There also are a very small pool of truly undecided voters. Finding these people is difficult, and buying media that will reach them will be even more difficult since they tend to be not associated with any normal flow ideologically. Let's decrypt that a little bit. So instead of being equipped with a regular flow like watching the news or whatnot, true undecided voters may be very difficult to reach if they exist. So your impressions are limited, it gets more and more difficult to change the public's perspective on your candidate, and it gets even worse. We can run out of media. It is entirely possible, if not likely, that all of the television advertisements could be purchased by the time you get to Election Day. Section 315 of the Communication Act allows an officially authorized candidate for the ballot, so a person who will be on the ballot, to buy ads at the minimum available rate, 60 days before the election. So sometime in August, usually early August, all of the campaign time, all the time for the election is being purchased. Thus, it wouldn't matter if you had $50 million in October because all the TV ads were purchased months ago. So, in an election, you get through the primary cycle for president or whatever race, and then you have a short window to spend your money, set the stage for the election, and then move into the active phase of campaigning. The election thus happens in a particular order. You have to be introduced to the public, go through a debate process, be validated through a series of elections, and then you enter into the main stage of the campaign, where you again have an introduction phase and then the main body of the presidential campaign. What's striking is that by the time you reach the main body of the presidential campaign, almost all of the strategic work is already done. Case study, the 2012 election. There were two primary candidates for president in the 2012 election, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Barack Obama focused on a strategy that involved a mobile app that facilitated getting voters physically to the polls. He accompanied this strategy with a series of tightly targeted advertisements on cable. This was a relatively new style of campaign. It focused on traditional constituent work, getting people to the polls, just regular retail politics, and a variety of small advertising buys, trying to reach out at very particular audiences. Mitt Romney focused on the mobile website that could do some assistance with voting, but was not nearly as nimble in supporting his campaign volunteers and getting people to the polls. His primary media strategy involved a large number of wide media buys. Thus, it was likely that you would see ads for Romney during, say, American Idol, or a show like American Idol, but that you wouldn't see an ad for Obama, because Obama was buying an advertisement on a cable show at the same time. In October, Romney had a major cash advantage that he claimed, or one of his campaign advisors claimed, would be a fire hose to finish the election. By early October 2012, the Obama campaign had already spent $969 million. This will become an important detail as this presentation goes forward. Who had more votes? Obama. Who won the election? Obama. Pretty straightforward here. In a world where the election is decided by the person with the most votes, it doesn't matter if you end the campaign with $20 or $30 million on hand. It matters that you spent that money. If you then subtract that from the total campaign pools, the Obama campaign likely spent about $100 million more than the Romney campaign by the time it was all over. There are a number of posts that were linked for this class that claimed that Romney was quote-unquote winning social media. There are key details here. Was he winning? No. Most posts on Twitter related to politics are negative. They are attacks. And so unlike basketball, a high number is bad. In fact, social media politics are like golf. You want your number to be lower. There are a number of these posts claim that conservatives were winning because there were so many more mentions of Romney. In a world where Romney is mentioned, and we know that there's a 70-30 split of negative impressions to positive impressions, winning social media by being mentioned more is actually a sign that you're losing. And if you're losing by a 70-30 margin, you really are losing. You might ask about the impact of super PACs. The power of super PACs is overrated. The primary has become a major part of American hyperpartisan strategy because the super PACs are so inefficient. Here's what I mean by that. A super PAC is not able to buy television advertising at the lowest available rate, like a campaign can. Instead, a super PAC has to buy at whatever rate the TV station wants. So a TV station will then say, wow, some millionaire wants to buy advertisements. I'm going to take them for every penny they have, which is very different than the campaign. A campaign, then, that's properly funded can buy plenty of advertising at a very reasonable rate when a super PAC challenging them cannot. This is a reason why those PACs and other groups have focused on primary elections, so that then they control the candidate in the major election or the main election, as opposed to having to try to inject themselves into that election with an established candidate they may not like and spending inordinate amounts of money to buy ads that other people can buy for cheap. Secondary question, does October matter? If you pay much attention to politics, you've probably heard a lot about the October surprise, the idea that there would be a current events twist that would happen during that month that would change everything in the election. Increasingly, it seems there is no October surprise, and that by the time you reach October, voters are so turned off and their minds are already so made up that it's almost impossible to win at that stage. Remember when Barack Obama supposedly lost the first presidential debate? Most incumbents lose the first presidential debate. Most people who go on to lose the election win the first presidential debate. Frankly, the debates happen too late. They happen after opinion formation. And in the case of the 2012 case study, Obama's early spending to build a superior app and launch negative ads against Romney earlier in the campaign had already set the stage for the ending. That Romney's Q-score was low, his negatives were high, and the Obama campaign was working on the base strategy to get voters to the polls. Remember, the person who gets the most votes wins the election. Not the person with the most social media mentions, and not the person with the most cash on hand at the end of the game. So does October matter? Probably not. Absent some sort of major snafu or scandal, it seems unlikely that political polarities would change substantially during the final phase of the election. Remember in October of 2012, there was a great deal of consternation about what were then called unskewed polls. These polls supposedly would rebalance the electorate to have a more accurate representation that was not available in polls. Polls use a model of the American electorate, and that electorate tends to have more liberals than conservatives, and thus they add more Democrats than Republicans to each individual sample. This is not an error. This is a model of who will be likely voting. By unskewing the polls, people would create an impression that there could be a wider, there could actually be a closer election than there actually would be. Generally, by October, polling is pretty clear, and there are very rarely upsets that happen from the beginning of September on. Basic thing here, does October matter? Probably not. Everyone just wants it to be over. And they like Halloween. Here's the summary. Election 12 and going forward. Old-fashioned campaigns work. I wrote about this in the magazine article you read. That is the key. Get out there, shake hands, kiss babies, push wheelchairs into the polling places. Or if you're in the West, knock on people's doors and say, come on, take your ballot down to the drop box. Counting total media is trivial. The horse race narrative in modern electoral journalism does a real disservice to actually understanding what the election is and what it does. Understand the objective. More votes equals a win. You don't need to win with the Beltway insiders. You need to get more people to the polls to press the election button. Or as I say in in-person classes, I draw a picture of this on the board, you need to get people to the democracy factory. Tight targeting is the key to the future. The 30,000-foot era is ending. It seems unlikely that a president or a friend in the near future will be elected by not doing retail politics and simply fundraising and dropping advertisements everywhere. Remember, Mitt Romney was in the states with agricultural fairs during those fairs and skipped them to go to fundraisers. It likely would have been better for his campaign to have less money and more personal contact. The 30,000-foot strategy presumes that the majority of media is widely purchased, so network television broadcasts. Instead, media is increasingly tightly focused. Buys can be made on social media for a very small number of people. Messages can be highly targeted. You would no longer need to have a $50 million war chest available to buy media in October, Because A, you should have already purchased that media, and B, you shouldn't need that much money if you're going to be making targeted buys in the first place. Remember what Norm Abrams said on This Old House: measure twice, cut once. Or in this case, target twice, spend once. Finally, there is no magic social media strategy for winning the election. Instead, there is the classic strategy for winning the election that involves providing optimal service to your constituents or partisans and seeing to it that they are able to vote. That is the most effective way to win any election, by having the most votes. In summary, social media and politics. More politics, less social media. Social media can be an important part of your messaging strategy, but ultimately is secondary to the objective of physical contact and getting people out to vote.